Hello friends, for today's video I want to do an if you like this, try that. Specifically, if you like these popular adult fantasy works, you might like these other works as well. Jumping straight into it, the first one we're going to kick it off with is one that typically when we talk about popular adult fantasy works, we actually talk about its predecessor, but it in its own right is actually quite popular, and that would be Mistborn Era 2. If you haven't picked up Era 1, it is advised to read Era 1 first, but some people are those rare individuals who prefer hearing about the original through the lore and the things that have changed and then going back and feeling like it's a prequel of sorts. But regardless, if you've read Mistborn Era 2, you know that it is not just unique and separate from Mistborn Era 1, it's actually quite distinct within fantasy works in general for its setting and its tone. So it does have more of this Wild West gaslamp feel, which is its own subgenre that has a lot of works within it, but a lot of the works are not quite that popular and don't reach the heights that the epic fantasy books do, the romantasy and the cozy fantasy do. Gaslamp is something that it feels like you get really when you get into the trenches of fantasy. So I think that really brought to life for a lot of people, oh, I actually really like this subgenre of fantasy. So in that way, I think that that's going to tie into the recommendation that I give, but also the tone of this, while it does have epic fantasy feels to it in that it's a quartet, so it's longer, the magic system is really cool, and you do have the lore that is very far-reaching, and there's a lot that's baked into the world itself and how society functions. While all of that is true, it also has that alongside this kind of campy fun feel, and that's, I think, at odds for a lot of people. Most of the time when we pick up epic fantasy or things with really big stakes, they have more of a serious feeling to them. And that is not true for Mistborn Era 2, and that's also not true for Emperor's Edge, which is the thing that I am recommending for if you like Era 2. I actually found that Emperor's Edge, it started relatively contained, it was a lot of fun, but it is a longer series. I've not had the chance to complete the series, but it is something that goes on for quite a lot of books, and so if you're somebody who just misses having a story that you can come back to time and time again, you're gonna get that with Emperor's Edge. And from what I've heard from people that have gone on to read the entirety of the story, it just gets better and better, which is so exciting. But the first book, you're following a character who is somebody that is really, really hardworking. They put in so much effort, but because of some of the restrictions within their society, they're not able to ascend to higher positions in the way that they deserve. And they're starting to become somewhat desperate. They are very kind of career-oriented, you could say, very goal-oriented. And an opportunity presents itself that seems a little bit suspicious, but our character is desperate and they take it. And that opportunity is trying to find somebody who is going to try and assassinate the emperor. Through some interesting circumstances, our character actually ends up on the side of the assassin, and they're discovering that there is a plot that is actually meant to make that individual the scapegoat and actually get to the emperor and potentially even stage some kind of coup. So our character, who's very by the books and a buttoned up type of character, now finds herself on the side of the very people that she typically is trying to hunt down. And you can see already some of the parallels if you've picked up Mistborn Era 2, because in Mistborn Era 2 you follow Wax, who is a lawman, and there is a lot of moral questions that arise throughout the story. It does, in both situations, as I noted before, have that sort of gaslamp feeling where it's more modern than what we typically find in fantasy, but not necessarily literally modern day. So I do think that the settings have some feelings that are similar, and then I noted before at the tone itself, there is this sort of campy, fun feeling, even though the stakes themselves are quite high. What I was highlighting before about the previous two books being rather different from what we typically get, these next two are going to be more of a return to this kind of classic fantasy and authors who are giants in their own way within the genre, and that would be specifically Guards and Terry Pratchett, and I'm comparing this to I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons. The thing that really ties these together is the very different way that we find that these stories are told in comparison to a lot of modern fantasy works. When I reviewed I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons, I noted that the way the story is told is very different and that it presents a different kind of feeling as you're reading. So there is sort of this wink, wink, nudge, nudge, where it almost comes across like the author is including you a little bit more, and that they're telling you this tale, and that there are these life lessons to pull, which are true of basically all books, or a lot of books. Not true maybe of every book. Some books are meant to just be fun, but a lot of books have meaning, of course, and there are certain thematic elements they're trying to present to you, but there is a feeling that is present within both of these stories where there are these thematic elements that are sort of woven into this story in a way where it feels like you're being told a tale by this amazing storyteller, and that you're sort of gaining insight into wisdom through the way that the plots progress. The plots don't always progress in a very streamlined way. They sometimes feel like things just sort of happen, and in a sense that almost feels more realistic, but simultaneously borderline less satisfying from an entertainment perspective. I do think of these two that Terry Pratchett is very cheeky, much funnier, I would say, certainly, but the stories do have this sort of nonsensical feel while having that feeling of, even though everything kind of happens at random and that feels realistic, the characters sometimes are larger than life, but they're very much tying their themes to real life in a way that's not particularly subtle, but it's still really a lot of fun. The next comparison I wanted to make would be between Robin Hobb's Liveship traders and the standalone story Dragonfruit. I am assuming that most people are aware of the goings-on with the popular fantasy works, but I don't want to reveal too much, so I'm going to have to be somewhat vague in how I present the comparisons between these, but it has to do with the lore of beings, of mythological creatures. There is something about Liveship traders that on surface level, when people present to you what that story is about, they're not able to tap into as much because it's sort of a discovery portion of the story. And I think that's true of a lot of Realm of the Elderlings in general, and that's something that people that are enormous fans of that series will tell you, is that there's so much lore, but it's sort of in the background, and it maintains that feeling of lore, of sort of reaching back, and there's this mystery that you're uncovering clues to over the course of all of these different books, and then you have this greater understanding of the world once you have gone through years and years and years of people's lives within this story. And within Liveship Traders alone, you are sort of discovering things to do with, because it's a seafaring story, the creatures of the sea. And that's where I'm going to kind of leave that because I don't want to say too much more. But that is true of something that you're looking at with Dragonfruit. In Dragonfruit, you are looking at these individuals who are trying to sort of preserve their way of life, their culture, and their connection to animals and mythological creatures to us, but to them, they're actually these beings that exist. And there are other individuals who are just trying to sort of take and conquer and force upon this island culture their way of life. And you do see characters that are trying to sort of push back against that. There are a lot of parallels between the kinds of creatures and the kind of lore that is presented, and this very almost wild nature between the humans and the mythical creatures. They're not necessarily cute buddy animal companions all the time. There is this, no, these are their own beings with their own agency, and they are dangerous. There's that feeling where you want them to side with humans, but at the same time, you don't know that there ever is that possibility, and it just feels like this monumental thing to conquer. I do think that the lore is explored really in a fascinating way between both of these stories. For this next one, there are actually going to be two things recommended, and I feel all of them are their own kind of popular depending on what circle you're in. So the book that I'm going to have as the popular fantasy work would be A Song to Drown Rivers. This is a newer fantasy release. It doesn't feel particularly fantasy-like until later on in the story. Most of it feels like this court intrigue type of story where you have a character who is placed within this environment where they are trying to gain information they can send back to other people. But as they're gaining information, they're starting to realize that maybe everything that pushed them to this point to want to take down this group of people, they're starting to realize that there's more sides to the story than they realize, and there's other people that are going to be caught up in whatever happens with the information that's passed along. And I do think if you're a fan of intrigue and gray morality, A Song to Drown Rivers did that really, really well. It's not necessarily a story that's known for its magic system like Mistborn is necessarily, and it's not something that feels really fantastical with the lore that's far-reaching like Ship of Magic. However, I do think that if you're an intrigue fan, you're definitely going to get that, and sometimes you want a story that's a little bit more contained as well. It feels a little more personal. And the two stories that I wanted to recommend that have some parallels, one is another book that's not fantasy, but because of the historical fiction feel of both of these, I think this is a great one, and it is a mystery which plays pretty well into A Song to Drown Rivers, and that would be A Crane Among Wolves. You are looking at this individual who rules in a way that is horrible. They mistreat individuals, and one of our protagonists is somebody whose sister was taken to be a concubine, and they want to rescue their sister. And then you are seeing somebody else who is somewhat involved in the court. And then another story, and it's not a book, but if you haven't checked it out, it's like a much more fun version of what I've been describing, and that would be Apothecary Diaries. so much fun. It's so much fun. But also the main character, Mao Mao, anybody who ends up checking out Apothecary Diaries, I feel like comes away from it loving this character, and there are entire videos dedicated to how Mao Mao has sort of transformed our protagonists, and she's absolutely fantastic. But the setup is that she's a character that has been sold into servitude, essentially, to... There's this massive palace, and there's different areas of this court, and she has been forced into servitude to a certain area, and she's somebody that has a lot of knowledge when it comes to poisons, as she is somebody that worked for an apothecary, and specifically is related to somebody who is an apothecary. So she has a great deal of knowledge. She also seeks knowledge all the time, and she kind of can't help but notice when things are starting to happen in the court, where somebody seems to be sick, but she doesn't think they're sick from natural causes, and somebody else notices her noticing things, and they sort of recruit her, trying not to get too involved with things at the same time, because she knows the more involved she gets, the more dangerous things are for her, and she's a very practical, pragmatic protagonist. She's the best. But if you like intrigue, mystery, anything like that, if you like court politics, all three of these stories, I definitely think if you like one, try the other. The last one for today is the only one where the one I'm recommending is not a book. Obviously, in the previous one, I recommended Apothecary Diaries, which comes in light novel form, it comes in an anime, and there is manga. However, I also ensured that we were also recommending a book. This last one, the only thing I'm recommending happens to be a show. The book itself would be Spark of the Everflame. The show would be Arcane. I do think when it comes to certain aspects of these stories, they're very different from each other. Spark of the Everflame is known within a lot of fantasy romance circles, whereas Arcane, that is obviously not really the situation within Arcane, but their class system of there being this sort of distinction between the elite and the people that have access to all of the wealth and the prestige and the magic versus the people that are at the bottom. That setup within Spark of the Everflame is very, very present within Arcane, and it's explored exceptionally within Arcane. And then also you have characters that are sort of trying to decide if they want to be a part of a resistance or if they just kind of want to take care of their own. I think you very much see that with the character of Vi in Arcane, where previously she wanted to take the system down. She hated the way that people like her and the people she cared about were treated. But later in the story, all she wants to do is protect her sister, and you see within Spark of the Everflame that that main character is somebody who kind of catches wind of things. They sometimes feel like, I've had enough, I want to help fight, I want to help the resistance. And other times they realize anything that happens with the resistance puts my family in danger, it puts my brother in danger, so you once again have a sibling taking care of a sibling. And you have characters that are younger and have kind of had the older sibling / parental role where there is a combination of both those things and they're being forced to grow up at too young of an age. I'm not trying to necessarily imply that I think the characters themselves are identical in any fashion, but I do think that their circumstances are somewhat similar, and I also think that the worlds themselves, the backdrop that sort of motivates a lot of what they do, is very similar from one to the next. That's it for some if you like this try that recommendations. I'll have everything linked in the description bar, as well as any additional videos that go hand in hand with these. And if you have any of your own recommendations, feel free of course to leave those so that anybody that comes to this video doesn't just have my recommendations, but yours as well. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.